welcome to another story in our channel. I hope you enjoy this.
She had been warned about Seoul in October. Her father's old business partner, a graying Ghanaian man who had spent 30 years moving cargo between continents, had told her over a dinner of egusi and pounded yam that Seoul in October was not a city, it was a test. The buildings were too clean, the people moved too fast, and underneath all that precision and glass was something that watched you and waited to see if you would flinch. Amara Adeyemi had listened. She had nodded. And then she had packed her best suits, booked a suite at the Latte Hotel, and decided that if Seoul was a test, she intended to pass it with distinction. If you are watching this video, comment your country and hit the like button. She was 29 years old, and she had never failed anything in her life that mattered. The daughter of Tunde Adeyemi, founder of AdeyShip Global, the largest privately held shipping and logistics company in West Africa. Amara had grown up watching her father turn nothing into something with the patience of a man who understood tides. He had built his empire dock by dock, route by route, shaking hands with port officials in Lagos, Dakar, Abidjan, and Mombasa long before the rest of the world decided Africa was worth paying attention to. She had been raised in boardrooms and at harbor terminals, and by the time she turned 25 and walked into her first solo negotiation in Rotterdam, she already knew that the most dangerous thing a person could underestimate was a composed woman with a plan. The deal that had brought her to Seoul was the kind that came once in a career. A logistics corridor between West Africa and South Korea, a direct shipping lane that would cut transit time by 40% and position AdeyShip as the primary freight partner for one of the most industrially aggressive economies in Asia. The South Korean company on the other side of the table was called Jeon International Holdings. Their portfolio was broad: shipping infrastructure, port development, cold chain logistics, private equity. Their headquarters occupied the top 12 floors of a tower in Gangnam that was so new it still smelled faintly of concrete beneath the marble. Their reputation was immaculate. Their financials, at least the ones that were publicly available, were pristine. Amara had done her homework. She had read every annual report, every trade press mention, every English-language summary of their Korean business filings. She had hired a consultant in Seoul to brief her on cultural protocol, negotiation style, Korean corporate hierarchy, and the art of reading silence in a room. She had arrived 2 days early to adjust to the time zone, walk the city, and ground herself. She had eaten alone at a pojangmaka near her hotel, sitting on a plastic stool under orange light with a paper cup of oating broth warming her palms, watching the city move around her, and she had felt, for the first time in months, the particular electricity that came before something that would change everything. She did not know then that she was right. The first meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Amara arrived at 8:50 in a black wool coat over a deep burgundy suit, her locks pinned back in a crown that her mother had taught her meant you are walking into power. Carry yourself accordingly. She wore small gold earrings shaped like cowrie shells, a habit she had kept since university, a quiet declaration. Her briefcase held 3 copies of the preliminary proposal, a bound market analysis that her team had spent 6 weeks preparing, and a single photograph tucked into the inner pocket. Her father standing at the Lagos port the year he opened his first terminal, young and unpolished and completely certain. The lobby of Jeon International Holdings was all white stone and negative space. The kind of place designed to make you feel small and then make you grateful for being allowed inside. The receptionist greeted her in careful English. A junior associate appeared with a bow and led her to the 47th floor. The elevator doors were mirrored, and Amara spent the 47th floor ascent looking at herself, adjusting nothing, because there was nothing to adjust. The conference room was long and cold and lined with glass on one side, the city of Seoul spread out below like a circuit board. There was a table that seated 20, though only 6 chairs had been prepared for this meeting, 3 on each side. There were small bottles of water, a tray of fruit, and a silence so complete that Amara could hear the ventilation system breathing. She took the center seat on her side of the table and arranged her materials with the deliberateness of someone who had been told once by her father that how you place your papers in a room tells the other side everything about whether they should fear you. She had been waiting perhaps 4 minutes when the door opened. She had told herself, in the way professionals do, that it did not matter what the people across the table looked like. That bodies and faces were irrelevant information. That she was here for numbers and routes and contract terms. She had told herself this sincerely and believed it completely. right up until Jeon Hyun-woo walked into the room and made a quiet, thorough mess of everything she had planned. He was tall in a way that was almost architectural, as if his body had been designed with the same attention to line and proportion as the building around him. He wore a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for him and no one else, and he moved through the room with the kind of stillness that men who had never needed to perform authority always had. His face was severe and beautiful in the way of things built to endure: strong jaw, heavy brows, eyes that were so dark they seemed to absorb the light from the windows rather than reflect it. He could not have been more than 32 or 33. He looked like he had been 33 for a very long time. He sat directly across from her and said nothing for a moment that stretched just long enough to mean something. Then he spoke in English, and his voice was low and even, with an accent that was Korean underneath and something international on top, the vowels of a man educated abroad, who had then come home and remembered what home actually cost. "Ms. Adeyemi, welcome to Seoul. I hope the city has been kind to you." "So far," she said. "I'm still forming my opinion." Something moved in his face. Not a smile. Something smaller and more precise than a smile. An acknowledgement. They went through the formal introductions. He had 2 associates with him, a logistics director and a legal advisor, both of whom sat very straight and spoke only when addressed. Amara had brought her operations director, a compact and meticulous woman named Chisholm, and her legal counsel, a British Ghanaian man named David who had been practicing international trade law for 20 years. The meeting opened in the prescribed Korean corporate fashion, formal, layered with deference toward the senior representative, which was Hyun-woo, who received the deference the way a statue receives weather. Amara presented the AdeyShip proposal with the same precision and warmth she brought to every pitch, letting the numbers do the heavy lifting while her voice and her posture held the room. She watched Hyun-woo as she spoke. He did not take notes. He did not reach for water. He simply listened, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and the quality of his attention was something she had not encountered before. It felt less like being watched and more like being read. When she finished, he asked 3 questions. All 3 were the right questions. The questions that got to the structural tension in the proposal, the places where AdeyShip was strongest and where the risk lay. She answered each one without hesitation, because she had anticipated all 3 during the 6 weeks her team had spent building the proposal, and also because something about the precision of his questions made her want to meet them precisely. They agreed to reconvene in 2 days, after both sides had reviewed the preliminary terms. The meeting ended with bows and formal pleasantness, and the low hum of things unsaid. In the elevator going down, Chisholm leaned close to Amara and whispered, "That man did not blink once in 90 minutes. "I noticed," Amara said. "Is that normal here?" "I don't know," Amara said. "But I intend to find out." What she did not know, what she could not have known, not yet, was that on the 47th floor, after she had left, Jeon Hyun-woo remained seated alone in the conference room for 11 minutes. His associates had gone. The fruit tray was untouched. He sat with his hands still flat on the table and looked at the space across from him where Amara Adeyemi had sat, and he thought about the way she had held the room. Not by commanding it, but by filling it, the way a fire fills a cold space, naturally and without apology. He thought about the cowrie shell earrings. He thought about the photograph he had glimpsed when she opened her briefcase, and the way her hand had touched it briefly before closing the case again. A small, unconscious gesture of something private and dear. He thought about all of this, and then he picked up his phone and called his father. Jeon Sang-chul answered on the first ring, as he always did, because Jeon Sang-chul slept 4 hours a night and spent the remaining 20 engaged in the management of an empire that officially looked like a holding company and unofficially held the eastern seaboard of South Korea in a fist that had never once needed to open. "She's good," Hyun-woo said. No preamble. His father did not appreciate preamble. "Of course she is." His father's voice was the sound of gravel under pressure. Her father built an empire with nothing but instinct and stubbornness. She's had both and better schooling. "What did you think of the proposal?" "It's strong. The routing model is innovative. If they execute it properly, they'll cut our existing partners' margins significantly. Which is why we need to own it or bury it," his father said. "Not both. One or the other. You know which I prefer." Hyun-woo said nothing. "Get close to her," his father said. "Not in the boardroom. Outside it. Find what she values, what she's afraid of, what she wants beyond the deal. Every person who walks into a negotiation is carrying something they need that isn't written in the proposal. Find hers. And then you'll know how to take the deal out from under her and make her believe she chose to let it go. Hyun-woo looked at the Seoul skyline through the conference room glass. It was brilliant in the morning light, all steel and reflection. Understood, he said. What he did not say, and would not say, not to his father, not yet, was that something about the woman who had sat across from him that morning had made the word understood feel, for the first time in his life, like a small betrayal. That evening, Amara stood on the terrace of her hotel suite in a silk robe with a glass of red wine and the city of Seoul blazing below her. She called her father. He picked up on the third ring, and she could hear the sounds of Lagos behind him. Traffic, distant music, the particular chaos of a house that had always been full. "How was the first meeting?" he asked. "Interesting," she said. "The heir runs the negotiations himself. Jeon Hyun-woo. He's sharp." "Sharp how?" She thought about it. "Like something that was made to cut," she said finally. Her father was quiet for a moment. "Be careful with people like that, Amara. They're either the most honest people in any room or the most dangerous." "Why?" "Because they don't waste energy pretending. Whatever they're doing, they mean it." She thought about that after she hung up. She thought about it while the city burned orange and silver below her, and she thought about those dark eyes that had watched her across the table with an attention that felt somehow both calculated and entirely involuntary. She finished her wine. She went inside. She opened her laptop and found an email from David, her legal counsel, flagged urgent. He had been doing additional due diligence that afternoon, running Jeon International Holdings through a more detailed background search using a Korean-language service his firm used for Asia-Pacific deals. The email was 3 sentences long. The last sentence was, "We need to talk first thing tomorrow. Something is not right about this company." Amara read it twice. Then she closed the laptop, sat in the dark of her hotel room for a long moment, and made herself breathe slowly and deliberately the way her grandmother had taught her. The way Yoruba women breathed when they were about to step into the fire. In, out, again. She was not afraid. She had never been the kind of woman who ran from fire. But she understood, sitting there in the Seoul dark, that the test her father's old partner had warned her about had just officially begun, and that it was going to demand more from her than any deal she had ever negotiated. Across the city, in a penthouse in Gangnam that no one who hadn't been invited had ever seen from the inside, Jeon Sang-chul poured himself a glass of scotch and reviewed the surveillance photographs of Amara Adeyemi that his security team had taken in the lobby of his building that morning. He studied each one with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had spent 40 years deciding how dangerous other people were. He set the photographs down. He picked up his phone. He called a man who was not listed in any contact book under his real function, and he said 4 words. "Watch the African woman." Then he hung up and finished his scotch, and the night moved around his tower like a tide that had learned to keep its distance. David sat across from Amara at a corner table in the hotel restaurant the next morning with the kind of expression she recognized from years of working with lawyers. The specific arrangement of a face that was about to deliver something unpleasant in the most careful possible language. She had ordered coffee and jollof rice from a Nigerian restaurant the concierge had found nearby, packed and sent over in a container that smelled of smoke and tomatoes and home. She ate it slowly, deliberately, while David arranged his papers, because she had learned that the best way to receive bad news was to be nourished when it arrived. Jeon International Holdings, David began, is real. The holding company, the logistics infrastructure, the financial filings, all of it is legitimate on the surface. But when you go 3 layers deep into the ownership structure, you hit a name that doesn't belong in a shipping company. You hit it in their private equity arm, in 2 of their subsidiary boards, and in the silent partner disclosures of their port development fund in Busan. He turned a page toward her. Jeon Sang-chul, the patriarch. Before he became a businessman, he spent 12 years running operations for a criminal organization called the Chongpa, one of the oldest and most sophisticated organized crime networks in South Korea. He went legitimate in the early 2000s, or at least he went partially legitimate. He built the holding company as a clean face. But the money that seeded it, the money that is now sitting in the infrastructure we are about to partner with, came from the Chongpa. Amara set down her fork. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough that our firm's sole correspondent flagged it immediately." certain enough that I am sitting here at 7 in the morning instead of sleeping." He paused. "Amara, this is the kind of family that doesn't lose business deals. They absorb them. The question you need to ask is not whether to proceed. The question is what they want from you that isn't in the proposal." She sat with that for a long moment. The restaurant was quiet around them, the early hour, the soft clatter of breakfast service. Through the window, Seoul was gray and cool, the streets slick from overnight rain. "The heir," she said. "Hyun-woo. Is he?" "He's the clean face," David said. "Educated in London, MBA from INSEAD, impeccable professional record. But he is his father's son. The patriarch runs everything. The heir executes." She nodded slowly. She looked out at the wet street. She thought about the way Hyun-woo had sat in that conference room, still and composed and watching, and she thought about what her father had said. Whatever they're doing, they mean it. She made her decision in the space of 10 seconds, the way she made all decisions that mattered, quickly, and without looking away from what the decision would cost. "We proceed," she said, "but we do it with our eyes open. I want you to document everything, every meeting, every communication. And I want a contingency brief prepared. What our legal exposure looks like if this deal is challenged after signing, and what our exit options are at each stage of negotiation." David looked at her for a moment. "You're going to walk back into that building knowing what you know." "I'm going to walk back into that building knowing what they don't know I know," she said. "That's different." She finished her rice. She went upstairs and changed into a deep green dress and her long coat and her cowrie shell earrings. She stood in front of the mirror for a moment and looked at herself, not checking, just acknowledging. Then she went back to Jeon International Holdings and sat down across from Jeon Hyun-woo and shook his hand and smiled. And behind her smile was a woman who was now playing an entirely different game. He noticed the change. She saw that he noticed it, a slight adjustment in the way he held himself across the table, a sharpening of the attention he had already trained on her. He said nothing about it. Neither did she. Instead, they discussed route protocols and insurance frameworks and port capacity, and the conversation was so technically intricate and so professionally conducted that anyone watching might have mistaken it for nothing more than two very capable people doing their jobs. But it was not that. It had not been that since the moment she walked back in. He asked, at the end of that day's session, if she had plans for the evening. She said no. He said if she was open to it, he would like to show her something of Seoul that wasn't a conference room. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring, sorting, deciding. "Where?" she asked. "Bukshin," he said. "The old quarter. You should see it before you go." She said yes, and she told herself it was strategic, that being outside the building, on less formal ground, would give her more information about what they actually wanted from her. She told herself this, and it was true, but it was not all of what was true. He took her to Bukshin Hanok village in a car with no driver visible and no conversation for the first 10 minutes of the drive, which Amara spent looking out the window at the city shifting from glass towers to something older, the streets narrowing and the light changing to something amber and slower. When they stepped out of the car, she understood immediately why he had chosen this place. The Hanok, the traditional wooden houses with their curved tile roofs, climbed the hillside in terraces, and the light of early evening made everything look like something from another century. Seoul sprawled below, still and enormous, but here, on this hill, it felt like the city held its breath. He walked beside her at a distance that was respectful and exact. He told her, without being asked, that this was the neighborhood where his mother had been born, a Bukshin girl, the daughter of a calligrapher whose work still hung in 3 national museums. That she had died when he was 11. That he came here sometimes when he needed to remember that he had once been a person before he became what he was. Amara looked at him when he said this, the profile of him against the tile rooftops and the evening sky, and something shifted in her chest. Not softness. Something more complicated than softness. "What did becoming what you are cost you?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and the surprise on his face was the first completely unguarded thing she had seen from him. She watched it arrive and depart, replaced by something quieter. "Everything that isn't visible," he said. They walked for 2 hours. They talked, slowly at first, and then with the accelerating honesty of people who rarely spoke truthfully to anyone. She told him about growing up at the harbor, about learning to read cargo manifests before she could read novels, about the specific loneliness of being the brilliant daughter of a powerful man in a world that assumed her brilliance was borrowed. He told her about London, 7 years of trying to be something other than his father's heir, and how he had returned because duty had a gravity that no amount of distance could fully escape. They did not talk about the deal. They did not talk about his father. They talked around the things that mattered most, the way people do when those things are starting to matter too much to risk directly. At a small pojangmaka, they sat on plastic stools and ate tteokbokki and fish cake and drank warm makgeolli from ceramic cups. And Amara thought of the night she had sat at the pojangmaka near her hotel on her first evening in Seoul, and how she had felt the electricity of something coming, and how completely she had misunderstood the shape of it. "You're not what I expected," he said at one point. "What did you expect?" He considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "Someone easier to understand," he said. "I'll take that," she said. He smiled then, a real smile, which was so different from the near smile in the conference room that it almost reorganized his face. It arrived without calculation, stayed for only a moment, and left behind an aftermath that Amara felt in her sternum. She told herself, walking back to the car at the end of the evening, that she had been right to come. She had information now that she hadn't had before. She knew that the heir was not simply his father's instrument, that there was a person inside the architecture of that family, someone who had once stood in a London street and wondered if he could be different. She knew that this was dangerous information, not because it made him less of a threat, but because it made him exactly the kind of threat she was least equipped to handle. She also knew, and this she did not tell herself directly, only felt it moving through her like a current, that she wanted to have dinner with him again, and that this wanting was going to be a problem. 3 days passed in a rhythm of conference room mornings and carefully arranged evenings. He took her to a jazz bar in Hongdae, where a Korean woman sang Nina Simone with such authenticity that Amara felt the song living in her bones. He took her to a private dining room where a chef prepared a 10-course meal that moved from Japanese influence to old Korean royal court cuisine, and Hyun-woo explained each dish with a quietness that felt like trust. She took him, one afternoon, to a West African cultural fair that the Nigerian embassy was hosting near Yongsan, dragging him, slightly reluctant, into a space of color and percussion and jollof rice that she watched him encounter with an open and genuine curiosity that disarmed her entirely. He ate suya standing at a counter with his suit jacket on and the spice making his eyes water, and he refused to admit it was too hot, and she laughed so hard she had to put a hand on the counter to steady herself, and the sound of her laughing made something in his face go very still and very attentive. The deal was progressing. In the conference room, they were approaching terms. Outside it, they were approaching something else entirely, and both of them knew it, and neither of them had said it aloud, because saying it aloud would have meant deciding what to do about it. On the 5th evening, he drove her to a viewpoint above the Han River. They stood at the railing and looked at the river, and the lights of the city doubled in the water below, and the wind came off the river cold and clean. Amara had her coat buttoned to the throat and her hands in her pockets, and she stood close enough to him that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. "Hyun-woo," she said. She had been using his name for 2 days now, and the way he received it, always just a small pause, a settling, told her that not many people did. "Yes. What does your father actually want from this deal?" The silence that followed was the longest he had ever given her. She watched his jaw tighten. She watched him look at the river. "To own the route," he said finally. "Completely. Not as a partner. And the negotiation is designed to get you to trust us enough to share your proprietary routing model," he said, "and then to structure the final terms so that Jeon Holdings controls the intellectual property and AdeyShip becomes a contractor on its own innovation." He stopped. A long beat. "I wasn't going to tell you that." "I know," she said. "Then why did you ask?" "Because I wanted to see if you would," she said. He turned to look at her, and the look on his face was one she had never seen from him before, raw, almost fractured, like a wall that had been quietly stressed for a very long time, and this was the moment one crack appeared. "Amara," he said, and the way he said her name was entirely different from anything he had said before. It was not the professional courtesy of the conference room, not the careful warmth of the evenings. It was the sound of a man who had just said something that could not be unsaid, and knew it, and found that he did not regret it the way he should. She looked at him for a long moment. The river moved below them. A boat crossed under a bridge, and its lights blurred in the water. "What happens," she said, "if you tell your father you want to renegotiate the terms, that you want an actual partnership?" The crack closed. Not fully, but enough. She watched him reconstruct himself with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for 30 years. "That's not a conversation my father has," he said. "What kind of conversations does he have?" Hyun-woo looked back at the river. When he spoke, his voice was level and very quiet, and what it contained beneath the levelness was something she recognized as the specific grief of people who loved things they could not save. "The kind that end things," he said. She reached out, in the cold, and put her hand over his on the railing. He looked down at her hand. Then he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stood like that above the Han River while Seoul burned below them, and neither of them pretended that this was a negotiation anymore. What Amara did not know, what she would not know until it was almost too late, was that 3 floors below Jeon Sang-chul's penthouse, in a security room the size of a large closet, a man was looking at photographs taken with a telephoto lens. 2 figures at a railing above the Han River. A hand turning over. Fingers interlacing. The man sent the photographs upstairs without comment. Jeon Sang-chul received them, also without comment. He looked at them for a long time, and then he set them down and picked up his phone and called his son. The call lasted 43 seconds. It was the kind of conversation that did not require more time than that. When it was over, Hyun-woo stood in his apartment in Gangnam with his phone in his hand, and the expression on his face was one that had no name for it in English. Only the Korean word that meant the specific weight of knowing that something precious is about to be destroyed and being the one who will have to watch it happen. He sat down on the floor. He had not sat on the floor since he was a child. He sat there for a long time, and outside his window Seoul turned from night to the first pale edge of morning, and somewhere across the city Amara Adeyemi was sleeping in her hotel suite, and did not yet know that the order had changed. She knew something was wrong the moment she walked into the conference room the next morning. Not because anything in the room was different, the table, the water, the tray of fruit, the city view, all identical. Not because Hyun-woo said anything wrong. He greeted her with correct formality, introduced a new legal representative who had joined his team overnight, and opened the session with a comprehensive review of the previous day's progress. Everything was exactly right, which was exactly wrong, because the man who had held her hand above the Han River 12 hours ago was not in this room. What was in this room was the architecture that surrounded the man, every layer of professional composure and family training, installed and functioning like a machine, and the person inside it was nowhere visible. Chisholm noticed it too. She sent Amara a small message under the table. "He's different today." Something happened. Amara kept her face arranged and her voice steady and pushed through 2 hours of contract language review. But behind her eyes she was working a different problem. Running through everything she knew about the Jeon family, everything David had told her, and trying to map what the overnight could have produced that would have put Hyun-woo this far behind his own walls. When they broke for lunch, she did not go to the executive dining room where their teams were being entertained. She told Chisholm she needed air, took the elevator down alone, and stepped into the Gangnam Street. The October cold hit her cleanly. She stood on the pavement and called David. "Has anything changed on your end?" she asked. "I was about to call you," he said. "Our Seoul correspondent flagged something this morning. There's a history of deals the Jeon family has entered with foreign companies that ended badly for the foreign partner. Not publicly, no lawsuits, no press. But one Nigerian investment group that attempted a joint venture with one of their subsidiaries 4 years ago walked away with nothing and never spoke publicly about why. A German firm 2 years ago. Both withdrawals happened within days of each other, and both were preceded by a sudden, significant shift in the Jeon team's approach to negotiations." "What kind of shift?" "They stopped negotiating," David said. "They started applying pressure." She hung up. She stood on the street and let the October wind off the Han find her. She thought about her father, about the photograph in her briefcase, young Tund at the harbor, unpolished and certain. She thought about what her grandmother had told her when she was 16, the year her parents almost lost everything to a corrupt port official who had tried to extort AdeyShip into bankruptcy. Her grandmother had sat across from her at the kitchen table and taken her hands in both of hers and said, "The women of this family do not run. We hold our ground, and we make the ground worth holding." She went back into the building. She went to the 47th floor. She did not go to the conference room. She went to Hyun-woo's private office and knocked once and opened the door. He was at his desk, jacket off, sleeves folded back, reading something. He looked up, and something crossed his face. alarm, or relief, or the specific anguish of both at once. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. She stood in front of his desk and looked at him and said, "Tell me what changed last night." A long pause. The Seoul skyline was enormous behind him. "My father saw photographs," he said, "of us, at the river, and the conversation we had at the conference table yesterday. The things I told you, I don't know how, but he suspected. He called me last night, and he told me that my usefulness in this negotiation depends on whether I can still be trusted to act in the family's interest." He stopped. He said, "If I can't, I am no longer useful in this negotiation. And in my family, Amara, not being useful is not a status. It is a death sentence," she said. His eyes didn't flinch. "A reclassification," he said quietly, "which can amount to the same thing." She sat down across from him. Not the way she sat across from him in the conference room. This was different, closer, the desk between them feeling both necessary and wrong. "What does he want from me now?" she said. "Not the deal. Me specifically." Hyun-woo looked at his hands. "He wants you to sign a terms sheet by end of week that cedes the routing IP to Jeon Holdings. He wants it done before you have time to bring in additional legal review. He is going to make the deal look like the best offer you'll receive in Asia. And then after signing, Jeon Holdings will trigger a clause that your team will not find until it is too late, converting AdeyShip's role from partner to service contractor. And if I don't sign, he will make sure AdeyShip loses the other 2 Korean prospects you have been developing in parallel. He has relationships with both companies. They will decline without explanation within days." She sat with this. The city moved behind him, and the light was that particular cold Seoul October light that had no mercy in it. "He's going to do this regardless," she said. "The deal terms, whether you help him or not." "Yes. So what is your helping him actually change?" He looked up. The question had landed somewhere real. "It changes what he does with me," he said. "If I deliver the deal his way, I remain useful. If I don't," he stopped. "You said at the river," she said carefully, "that you spent 7 years in London trying to be something other than what this family made you. What was that person? The one in London?" His face went very still. "Someone who thought he could be clean," he said. "And you can't be clean as long as you're in that building. Amara, I'm not asking you to choose anything," she said. "I'm telling you what I see. What you do with it is yours." She stood. "I'm going back to the conference room. We're going to finish today's session properly. And then I am going to need 48 hours. For what? To decide how I fight back," she said. She walked to his door. She paused with her hand on the handle. Without turning around, she said, "Hyun-woo, whatever your father is, you did not choose to be born into it. But you are choosing, right now at this desk, what you will do about it. That is the only choice that will matter when this is over." She left. He sat at his desk for a long time after, and the thing on his face was not grief and not resolution, but something between them that was slowly becoming one or the other. That night, in her hotel suite, Amara called her father. This time she told him everything, David's findings, the IP clause, the pressure structure, Hyun-woo. All of it. Her father listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was frightened, because Amara Adeyemi always interrupted when he was comfortable and went silent when the stakes were real. When she finished, there was a pause that lasted long enough to hear Lagos breathing through the phone, traffic, generators, the particular percussion of a city that never fully slept. "Come home," her father said. "We walk away from the deal. We take what we've learned and we find a different route." "Baba," she said, "if we walk away, they do exactly what he said. They kill our other Korean prospects. And then in 6 months they find another African partner and they strip them of everything, and we watch it happen knowing we saw it coming. And if you stay?" "If I stay," she said, "I need you to make 2 calls. The first is to Minister Afolabi at the Trade Ministry. I need him to know we are in Seoul, and I need our government visibility on this deal. The second is to Uncle Emeka." Her father went very quiet. "Amara, Emeka is not. I know what Uncle Emeka is," she said. "And I know that John Sanctual understands exactly one kind of leverage, the kind that looks like his own." There was a very long silence. Then her father said, "You are too much like your grandmother." "Thank you," she said. Her father made the calls. What happened over the following 48 hours moved with the precision of a plan and the ferocity of something that had been backed into a corner and decided to stop retreating. Amara met with David and a Korean legal firm she had retained independently. Not the one the Jeon family had recommended, which she had dismissed from the first day as a conflict of interest. And together they combed through the proposed terms and found the conversion clause buried in a subsidiary agreement on page 41. They documented it. They built a counterstructure that ring-fenced the AdeyShip routing IP in an independently registered holding entity that no Jeon Holdings clause could touch without triggering international arbitration. And then Amara asked for an emergency meeting with Jeon Sang-chul himself. She had never met the patriarch. She had been shown photographs, a compact, hawk-faced man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed, with the patience of a man who had won so many fights that winning had become boring and only the destruction of those who surprised him retained any interest. He agreed to the meeting because people who underestimated her always assumed she was asking to surrender. They met in his private office at the top of the building, a room so different from the conference room below that it was almost a confession. Here there was wood instead of glass, and old Korean ink paintings on the walls, and a collection of jade artifacts in a lit case that Amara recognized immediately as priceless. He was standing when she entered. He did not bow. She did not bow either. They looked at each other across the room, like two people assessing how much the other had already guessed. She sat down before he offered her a seat. He noted this. Something in his face approved. "Ms. Adeyemi," he said, in Korean-accented English that was more fluent than he usually let on. "I understand you wanted to speak directly. I want to resolve this cleanly," she said. "Your team has a clause in the subsidiary agreement that converts AdeyShip from partner to contractor after signing. I have removed that clause from the deal structure. I have also registered the AdeyShip routing IP in an independent entity that places it outside Jeon Holdings' operational reach for the duration of the partnership and 18 months post-termination." He was very still. "Furthermore," she said, "I have shared a full record of our negotiations, including the approach your son was instructed to take, with the Korean Ministry of Trade and with the Nigerian Trade Commission. The Nigerian Trade Minister was briefed this morning by my father, who also spoke with a man named Adeyemi, my uncle, who operates significant interests in Lagos and Abuja that your family's West African expansion plans require access to. If you proceed with the terms you have designed, you do not simply lose this deal. You lose the continent." The silence in the room was total. Jeon Sang-chul looked at her for a very long time. She met his gaze without blinking, without adjusting. She let the silence do what it was doing. "You planned this before you walked into my building," he said finally. "I planned this when your son told me the truth," she said. "At the river." Another silence. Something moved behind the hawk eyes. Not quite respect, not quite anger, but something that contained both and was more dangerous than either. "What do you want?" he said. "A real partnership," she said. 50-50 on the route. AdeyShip retains IP ownership with a licensing structure that benefits both companies. Full governance rights for both boards. No conversion clauses. No silent mechanisms. She paused. "And your word, the kind your family keeps, because I understand it is the only currency you value, that AdeyShip's other Korean prospects are not touched." He was quiet for a very long moment. "My son told you all of this," he said. "Not a question. Your son told me the truth," she said, "which is rarer in this building than the jade in that case." He looked at the jade collection. He looked back at her. And then Jeon Sang-chul, patriarch of the oldest criminal dynasty in South Korea, a man who had not been surprised in 20 years, made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I'll review the revised terms," he said. She stood. "You have 24 hours," she said. "After that, I go home and we pursue the Singapore route, and you spend the next decade trying to build what we would have built together." She walked out of his office, and her legs were steady and her head was high and her hands were shaking, but only in the elevator, where no one could see, where she pressed her back against the mirrored wall and breathed the way her grandmother had taught her, in and out and in, until her hands were still and she was ready to walk back into the world. In the lobby, Hyun-woo was waiting. He had known she was meeting his father. He had not known what she planned to say. He stood in the center of the lobby looking at her as she walked out of the elevator, and whatever she saw in his face, the tension of it, the quality of the waiting, told her that this had cost him something to let happen, that he had stood down from whatever impulse told him to protect or control or intervene, and simply let her walk into that room and do what she came to Seoul to do. "How did he take it?" Hyun-woo asked. "He laughed," she said. Hyun-woo blinked. "He laughed." Almost, she said. It might have been respect. With men like your father, they look very similar. He looked at her for a long moment, the lobby cold and marble around them, the building of his entire life rising above them both. What happens now? He asked. Now we wait 24 hours, she said. And then we see what he chooses. She walked past him toward the exit. Then she stopped. Without turning, she said, You could have warned him. Last night, or this morning. You didn't. A pause behind her. No, he said quietly. I didn't. She walked out into the Seoul street. The October air was cold and clean and tasted, she thought, like the particular freedom of having done something that could not be undone. Jeon Sang-chul called at 11 o'clock the following morning. Amara was sitting cross-legged on her hotel bed with a cup of tea, and the contract revision documents spread around her when her phone buzzed. She picked it up, and his voice came through even and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he has finished deliberating and does not intend to revisit the decision. The terms you proposed, he said. We accept them. With one modification, the licensing fee structure. We need the first 3 years capped. I'll have our team send the revision within the hour. I'll review it and respond within 2 hours, she said. Fine, he said. Then, before hanging up, You negotiated well, Ms. Adeyemi. Your father raised something he should be proud of. He hung up before she could respond, which she suspected was intentional, giving her the compliment and removing the space for her to deflect it, the way a man who had spent his life reading people would know to do. She sat for a moment with her phone in her lap. Outside, Seoul was gray and bright simultaneously, the way it got when the clouds were thin enough for the light to push through without breaking them. She felt something move through her that was not quite triumph. It was more like the particular exhaustion and clarity that came after a very long run, when your body has used everything it had and what remains is simply true. She texted David. He called. Review the licensing modification when it arrives. She texted Chisholm. We did it. I'll explain everything over dinner. She texted her father a single Yoruba word, their family's shorthand, the word that meant I held the ground. And within 30 seconds he replied with the same word and nothing else, and she felt it in her chest like something opening. Then she sat for a moment longer, alone, and she thought about Hyun-woo. The deal had been won. The structure was clean. AdeyShip would leave Seoul with a real partnership, the IP protected, the route secured. She would go home having done what she came to do, and more, having done it against odds that were designed to make it impossible. She should have been thinking about celebration, about the flight home, about telling the story. She was thinking about a man standing at a railing above the Han River in the dark, turning his hand over, and what his face had looked like in the elevator lobby when she'd told him his father had laughed. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. Amara. He accepted, she said. A pause. I know. He told me this morning. Another pause. How do you feel? Tired, she said honestly. And clear. A beat. Hyun-woo. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. I've been answering you honestly for 10 days, he said. I don't know how to stop now. The line delivered it like a quiet strike to the sternum. She breathed past it. What happens to you, she said. After this. In that building. The pause that followed was long enough that she heard the Seoul wind on his end. He was somewhere outside, or near an open window. My father was not pleased with me, he said carefully. He knows I spoke to you at the river. He knows he stopped. He has said that there will be consequences. I don't know yet what shape they take. Hyun-woo. She said his name the way she had learned to say it, fully, without the protective shortening people did to names that were starting to mean too much. You told me the truth. At the river and in your office. And because of that, I was able to protect my family's company. You could have let it happen the way he planned. You didn't. Why? The silence that came was very long, and when he broke it his voice was different, lower, stripped of its professional calibration, the voice of the man in London who had wanted to be clean. Because I am tired, he said, of knowing what is being built and calling it something else. Of watching people walk into rooms my family designed to take from them and doing nothing. He stopped. Because you sat across from me in a conference room and I could see that you had earned everything you had, and I was being used to steal it, and his voice tightened. I have done things I am not proud of. I will spend a long time accounting for them. But I decided at the river that this would not be one of them. She was quiet for a long moment. The Seoul morning moved outside her window. Come to dinner, she said. Tonight. Not as counterparty, not as the heir, not as anything your family needs you to be. As the person who stood at the railing and told me the truth. Another long silence. Then, yes. They ate at a small restaurant in Insadong that Amara had found herself, away from the circuits of Gangnam, in a neighborhood of art galleries and tea houses and paper shops where the clientele were students and artists and couples who had been married for decades. They sat at a wooden table in a low-ceilinged room that smelled of jangjoram and barley tea, and they ate slowly, and they talked without any of the architecture of the previous 10 days. No conference room, no corporate language, no strategic distance. He told her about his mother, the full version, not the Buckshin summary. How she had been a teacher's daughter who fell in love with John Sangchul before she knew what he was, and spent the next 11 years discovering it layer by layer, and how by the end she was neither happy nor free but deeply, irreversibly loyal in the way that certain women love, even when the thing they love costs them everything. He had her calligraphy, one scroll, kept in a box, brought out once a year. He did not say what the scroll said. He did not need to. She told him about the year she decided she would not inherit her father's company as his daughter, but build her own seat at its table as a director. About the board members who had looked through her and over her and around her until she made it impossible to look anywhere but at her. About the specific texture of being a powerful woman in a world that credited your power to the men beside you, and the daily choice of whether to correct this with argument or simply with evidence. They talked about loneliness, the particular kind that exists at the top of things, surrounded by people who needed something from you and could not simply be with you. They talked about home, and what it cost to carry it and what it cost to leave it. They talked about the things people built to protect themselves that eventually became the things that imprisoned them. At some point in the evening, she could not have said exactly when, the conversation quieted, and they sat in the particular peace of two people who had said enough true things to each other that silence between them no longer needed to be filled. He was looking at her in the way he had looked at her since the first day in the conference room, but now it was uncalibrated, ungoverned, and she let herself look back without the professional layer she had kept in place since the first morning. "I don't know what comes next for you," she said. "In your father's house." "Neither do I," he said. "That's the most honest thing I've said about my life in years." "Are you afraid of it?" He considered this. "I'm afraid of staying," he said. "More than I'm afraid of what happens if I don't." Something in her chest moved toward him, then, with a force and a tenderness that she did not try to name, only felt, the way you feel a tide that has decided it is time. "Then don't stay," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Amara, I am not saying this because of what I feel," she said, and she held his gaze because she meant this to be honest and clean, nothing manipulative or pleading in it. "I am saying it because I watched you choose the right thing when no one who matters to you is going to reward you for it. And men who can do that, men who know what the right thing is and still pay the price for it, those men are rare. Don't waste that by going back into that building and disappearing back into what they made you." He was very still. The restaurant moved quietly around them, a low soundtrack of other lives, other evenings, the unhurried intimacy of a place with no urgency. "My father will not let it go cleanly," he said. "If I step back from the family, there are structures, obligations, people who ensure that exits are complicated." "I know," she said, "and I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I am asking you to know that there is a world outside that building where you are not the heir or the enforcer or the clean face. Where you are a man who knows shipping routes and Seoul history and how to eat suya without admitting it's too hot." He made a sound, the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him all evening. "That man," she said, "I would like to know what happens to him." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand, and held it the way he had held it at the river, turned over palm to palm, as if learning the shape of her. "What does happen to him?" he said, not rhetorically, as if she might actually know. "That depends on whether he has the courage to find out," she said. She flew home 3 days later. The deal was signed the morning before her flight. A ceremony conducted in the conference room on the 47th floor, with representatives from both companies, 2 government trade officials, and a delegation from the Nigerian embassy in Seoul. The terms were clean. The routing IP was protected. The governance structure was real. Chisholm cried silently during the signing and then immediately denied it. David shook hands with everyone within reach and then went outside and called his wife. Amara signed her name in blue ink on a document that her father would frame and hang at the entrance to the Lagos terminal, next to the photograph of young Tund at the harbor. She knew this without being told. Some things are certain. Hyun-woo signed for Jeon Holdings. His face was composed, his manner correct. They shook hands across the table for the cameras, and his hand held hers for a moment longer than necessary, and the quality of that fraction of a second, the weight of it, moved through her like a chord in a key she had not heard before. After, in the lobby, she said goodbye to his associates and to the government officials and to the embassy delegation. She said goodbye last to him, because she was going to say it once, and she wanted to say it right. They stood in the same lobby where he had waited for her after she had faced his father. The building rose around them, all marble and weight and generations of what his family had built. "The man in London," she said. "The one who wanted to be clean." He looked at her. "I think he's still there," she said. "I think he has been there the whole time, waiting to see if anyone would see him." His jaw tightened. His eyes were very dark and very open. "Take care of yourself, Amara," he said. It came out rough, under the smoothness, the roughness of something real. "You too," she said. She walked out of the Jeon International Holdings building and into the October Seoul air, and she did not look back, because she knew that if she did, she would see him still watching, and the sight of it would make walking forward harder than it already was, and she needed to walk forward, because forward was where her life was, where AdeyShip was, where her father and her city and her work were, and because the deal was done and Seoul was beautiful and cold, and this particular chapter, was ending. 2 months later, a message arrived through Chisholm's corporate email, forwarded to Amara's personal account. It was from a legal firm in London, not Korean, not Nigerian. 3 sentences long. The first said that the sender had resigned from his executive role at Jeon International Holdings effective 3 weeks prior. The second said that a restructured governance arrangement had been negotiated with the family, clean, with conditions on both sides, and that certain obligations had been met or dissolved in the process. The third sentence said only, "I found out what happens to him. I thought you should know." Amara read it 3 times. She sat at her desk in the Lagos office with the harbor visible through the window, the water bright and working, cranes and containers, and the low steady sound of commerce and arrival. She thought about the Han River and the cold, and the lights doubled in the water. She thought about Suyao and jazz, and a hallway outside a conference room, and the specific quality of a silence that meant someone was choosing to be different than they had been made. She wrote back in 3 sentences. The first said she was glad. The second said the partnership between AdeyShip and Jeon Holdings had entered its operational phase, and the first shared route was performing 20% above projection. The third sentence said, "If you're ever in Lagos, I'll show you what my father built. It's worth seeing." She sent it. She stood up from her desk. She walked to the window and stood looking at the harbor, at the water her father had trusted before anyone else had thought to, at the routes she had opened and the deals she had won and the ground she had held, and the woman she was, who was made of all of it, and who knew now that the test Seoul had offered her was not simply the one she had expected. It was the one that had asked her whether she could walk into fire and come out knowing what was worth keeping. The deal, yes. Her company, yes. Her name. But also this. The knowledge that somewhere in the world there was a man who had sat across a table designed to take from her and chose instead to give her the truth. And that the truth, freely given, was the only thing that built anything worth having. The harbor moved below her. A ship was coming in, heavy with cargo, moving slowly toward the dock with the particular dignity of things that carry weight and know their way home. She watched it arrive. The ground, as always, held. Subscribe to the channel for more story.
I'm sure you enjoyed this story, so don't forget to drop a comment and like, then subscribe.